from Connecticut, but close enough from the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. We have a very important topic to discuss today. It's international cooperation on internet freedom and openness. Every word here is positive: international cooperation, internet freedom, openness. So why is there even a debate? Uh, the German-American philosopher and social critic Erich Hoffer once said that every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. Uh, so perhaps we should look at ourselves and ask ourselves, have internet human rights traveled that route? Have we become a racket? Don't get me wrong, I love human rights. I support human rights. I'm married to human rights, literally. And I've written early articles, which sadly proved to be forward-looking in the Financial Times, for example, with titles, Why the Internet Will Be Bad for Democracy and an Unregulated Internet, question mark, Keep on Dreaming. Uh, and on the Columbia campus, after a year and a half of battles and battlefields, I'm the co-chair of two human rights academic freedom organizations. So I'm not insensitive, but we must also not become prisoners of the bubble. And in this polarized political environment, it's always easy to criticize the other side. Can you believe what they did now? Your own side will cheer. It takes more guts, I think, to tell your own side where they went wrong. But that is one of the roles of academia, I think. So I think that those people who believe that America has abandoned human rights on the internet should address several questions. One is, why is it the same people who once argued that America is too much in control of the internet, the same people now complain that America is abandoning the internet? Why is it the same people who wanted more UN involvement in the internet now complain that all of those authoritarian countries are predictably banding together to restrict the internet? Why is it that the same people who decry authoritarianism on the internet gathered, of all places, in Riyadh for the IGF Internet Governance Forum meeting? And lastly, why is it so many of the same people who are intense in their fear of the power of the major platforms correctly, were silent and supportive when the same platforms were policing the internet for disinformation? Now, we have three people here, all with Washington State Department backgrounds. They know diplomacy, in contrast maybe to me. Much of the discussion here in this period gets personalized around a president who shall be left unnamed. Some people support a past president who couldn't remember anything, and the other side supports a president who can't forget anything. But the conflict before us is not so much partisan, I think, Democrats versus Republican. It's not so much ideological, left versus right, but I think it's nationalists versus internationalists that the issue here. And those are two legitimate policy positions. There's nothing nefarious about them. The debate goes back to the early days of the American Republic, and for about 160 or so years, America was fairly staunchly isolationist. And it really changed only around World War II. And it stayed that way for about 80 years. And now there's a backlash to the internationalist position in many countries, not just the America. Backlash in the American working class, which sees internationalism as benefiting primarily the professional class. There was an election, and the nationalist position won. Like it or not, that's what democracy is all about. Elections have consequences. There's nothing nefarious about it. We are now sorting out the consequences. Some people are losing out. We're sad for them, but that's the consequence of elections. What is troubling, of course, is that in the meantime, the challenges to an open internet is creating coalitions. They're assembling of authoritarian governments. They're assembling tech tools of surveillance. They're learning how to game the international game, and they're creating coalitions. How do we deal with that? How does one protect an open internet internationally when the US government is not on the forefront? And how does one persuade the critics in America and in other countries that an open internet is also good for them and not just for the educated elite? And to answer this question, and these questions actually, we have a great panel, and will be led by Bill Drake, who is the director for international studies at the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation at the Columbia University. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Ellie. Those are very interesting remarks. And I will emphasize that indeed this is a bipartisan and nonpartisan discussion and focused in particular on international cooperation and coalitions around internet freedom and openness, not on how people feel about any particular individual or hair color. The topic was chosen for a mix of reasons, I think. I mean, one is there's long-term developing patterns of change at the international level with the growth of illiberalism and declining internet freedom as measured by many international organizations and bodies like Freedom House, and the growing coherence and activity of non-democratic governments in global policy processes, especially cybersecurity, but also other things related to internet freedom. And more immediately, of course, yes, there have been radical changes in U.S. foreign policy over the past 3 months, and there's a resulting kind of watershed moment in terms of strains on the geopolitical coalitions that have long been central to the promotion of internet freedom and openness. So it's worth thinking about what that means. I mean, just a week ago in Geneva, the United States was the only country in the world to vote against the draft UN resolution on the 20-year anniversary of the World Summit of the Information Society. So we've put the US at odds with the rest of the world in advance of a big negotiation in the UN later this year. And of course, as everybody knows, just yesterday, the administration announced major cuts to the State Department, including bits that are involved with promoting human rights and democracy overseas. And, the focus, I guess, was also timely because it's been 2 years this month since the US and 60 partner countries adopted a declaration on the future of the internet, promoting freedom and openness as objectives. Now, that declaration had issues, and I'm not focusing on that. I'm just saying it's a good time marker to consider how things have changed in a couple of months. So what I want to do today is kind of toggle back and forth a bit between the international level, what's happening with coalitions around freedom and openness, and what's happening at the national level with U.S. foreign policy. Maybe to level set things at the outset, I don't know who all has what background in this issue set. Let me just give a little bit of historical background on the evolution of U.S. policy here. I mean, obviously, it should be noted that the United States has long been an advocate of freedom of expression and information access, going back to the founding of the Republic. The U.S. has always advocated freedom to produce and disseminate information and communicate, seen this as integrally related to citizenship, rights, prosperity, and so on. And the U.S. has always, at the international level, advocated for the free flow of information with respect to print, broadcast, satellite, film, etc. And then this later, of course, translated into the computer age with the battles over transborder data flows and digital trade, etc. All of this has deep historical, cultural, and ideological roots. I mean, many people, particularly on the left, I think, sometimes ascribe U.S. Positions in this arena to material interests and say, well, it's just about U.S. businesses profit from open markets and information flows. That's a level of reductionism I think that even Marx wouldn't have embraced. I mean, obviously, both things are going on. There's both values issues and there's economic interests and geostrategic interests and so on involved in U.S. policy. But in any event, with the internet's rise in the 1990s, clearly the U.S. orientation towards freedom of information and flows extended to the new medium in the decades to follow. We had a bipartisan consensus across multiple presidential administrations to make internet freedom and openness a focus of U.S. foreign policy. And this really began with the Clinton administration and its global internet infrastructure initiative in 1994 and all the work it did in setting up the early mechanisms around internet governance. In the Bush administration, of course, the focus on individual freedoms and anti-censorship was amplified in the context of the whole neoconservative efforts to promote global democracy and open markets, which used to be of interest to Republicans. And under the Secretary of State Rice created in 2006 a global internet freedom task force And a leader in that work is with us on the panel today, what went on in that administration. Then in the Obama administration, we saw a significant expansion and formalization of the focus on freedom and openness after Secretary Clinton's famous 2010 speech on the subject. The U.S. Had a policy orientation that had three major prongs: the provision of tools to human rights defenders living in authoritarian regimes, which you might call the operational component of this, advocacy of personal freedoms to access and use the internet, and of course, advocacy of an open and lightly regulated internet at the global level. So today we're not going to talk so much about the operational side, more on the advocacy side, but these are all important parts. And the Obama administration has substantially staffed up this work and resourced it, engaged closely with stakeholders in civil society in the private sector, especially Google, which in particular, there was a kind of a revolving door, the senior staff between Google and the State Department. They created a Net Freedom Task Force, which replaced the old Bush one, adopted an international strategy for cyberspace, uh, launched support for things like the Open Technology Fund for the operational side. All this was at the time, you remember, those of us who are old remember these things, when the whole notion of soft power in the internet age as the new kind of approach to foreign policy was a major focus of things. And of course, it was all wrapped up with the Arab Spring and the political upheavals of the time, although the 2013 Snowden revelations threw all these efforts into a new and rather unflattering light and led to some criticism and pushback from foreign governments and key stakeholders, which we can talk about. Anyway, the point is, for all this, international cooperation and coalitions were key to the promotion of internet freedom and openness. It was the focus of a lot of work across administrations, building coalitions, first with the industrialized democracies of the West and the Pacific, later with varying North-South configurations, as well as multi-stakeholder groupings. And in parallel with this, there was the creation of bespoke new kinds of coalitions that were formed, like the Freedom Online Coalition, which was launched by the Dutch government in 2011, which has, today 42 governments involved and adopts joint statements and advice on questions of internet freedom and has a multi-stakeholder advisory group, et cetera. And the Global Network Initiative, created in 2008, multi-stakeholder coalition of companies, civil society actors, and academics with strong industry participation and guidance that has put forward self-regulatory best practice guidelines for multinational companies operating in repressive countries. It has done a lot of other advocacy work around internet freedom. And we have GNI's executive director with us on the panel today. And at the same time, of course, as Ellie alluded to, the growth of oppositional coalitions among authoritarian governments around the world who often were able to draw to their side some developing countries that weren't anti-democratic, but wanted to expand state authority in this area and offset American influence. So with the interplay between these different coalitions has defined the geopolitics of global digital governance in a wide variety of international settings ever since. And, obviously we had the first Trump administration, which was not so keenly involved, but didn't disable all this work entirely. Was more focused, though, on censorship alleged of MAGA and related voices than on what's going on in authoritarian countries. And outside the administration, in those years, we saw the birth of a debate about whether there needed to be some sort of new coalitions established, new alliances to support democracy. There was a lot of debate in foreign policy circles, if you read journals like Foreign Affairs, around the notion that we needed to have a new concert or league of democracies, some sort of new bloc that would work in the United Nations and so on. And that all carried into the Biden administration, which held a variety of summits on democracy. And there's a lot of debates about forming some sort of digital alliance of democracies or techno democracies, et cetera, to counter authoritarian statist kind of proposals and internet fragmentation. Ultimately, all proved too controversial and difficult. It didn't happen, but it did lead to the aforementioned declaration on the future of the internet. And the Biden administration did a lot of other things too, including having a special envoy for digital freedom, who's with us on the panel today as well, and launching initiatives on digital solidarity, et cetera. We can come back to the criticisms of all this work, and Ellie's alluded to some of these, but obviously people have had different views about the efficacy and coherence of the whole internet freedom agenda. But now, of course, it's all been thrown into some disarray with Trump 2.0. And I don't have to go into a lot of details about this because everybody here, I think, reads the newspaper or whatever we call them now, news sites. So we all know that there's a lot of dismemberment going on of different structures that have supported internet freedom work at the global level, and both within the government and outside the government, the U.S. Institute for Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, more importantly, I think to this and more direct to this panel, the multifaceted attacks on allies and the weakening of the Western alliance in a lot of important respects and the ways in which countries are responding to that. And the proposed forthcoming cuts, some say perhaps 90% of the US funding to the United Nations and other international organizations, which could have a massive effect. So we want to take stock of what is the status of international coalitions in support of internet freedom and openness. What's the state of play today? What's the possible evolution? What are the options going forward? And to do that, as Elliot noted, we have a panel a bit different from our usual. Three people who have actual hands-on foreign policy making experience in the State Department, who are now in civil society, academia, and the private sector. We have Eileen Donahoe, who served as the U.S. Special Envoy for Digital Freedom in the Biden administration, as the U.S. Ambassador to the Human Rights Council in the Obama administration. And between those diplomatic posts, Dr. Donohue was the Executive Director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University. Ambassador David Gross is a partner with the Washington, D.C. firm of Wiley Rein and served as the U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy in the Bush administration from 2001 to 2009, in which context David led more U.S. delegations to major international telecom conferences than anybody else in history, which is kind of an interesting feather in the cap, I guess. And then we have Jason Pellemeyer, sorry, Jason, who's Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. Mentioned previously, Jason was a special advisor for the U.S. Department of State from 2010 to 2017, where he led the Internet Freedom, Business, and Human Rights section in State Department. So what we're going to do, our usual mechanics, we'll do 3 rounds of Tour de Table, some broad questions that can shape the discussion, and then we'll have open dialogue for about a half hour. That open dialogue part is one of the things that makes this webinar series, I think, unique and interesting. So I hope people who have joined us will be up for joining the conversation when the time comes. So, all right, let's begin then. So a first question I want to pose to the panel, and again, these are fairly broad gauge. What has and has not been done in this issue area with respect to coalition building around internet freedom and openness? We're trying to set what's the baseline around this negotiation in this area. What's been successful? What have been the shortcomings? What are the lessons learned? Let's start there, and then we can move into what's going on today. So let me open it to the panel. Why don't we go in alphabetical order? So Eileen, could we start with you?
Sure. First, Bill, thanks for that very fulsome introduction and history table setting. And Ellie, I really appreciate your very provocative questions at the top. To answer Bill's question about what are the advances we've seen over time and what's the current state of affairs, I think that we really do need to think about a before January 25th or 21st and after January 2025. And so, I will just take that position with no hesitation. For me, it's just a sort of a black and white line and radical shift. My most recent posting in the US government was as Special Envoy for Digital Freedom. As Bill said, I just stepped out of the government at the end of the Biden administration, but it already feels like we are in a completely different epoch of history and American history. And we are definitely on a different trajectory in terms of the potential for ongoing international cooperation, especially on values-based internet governance, internet freedom, and coalitions. I have to admit, my perspective is shaped by my identity as an American and my experience as a diplomat representing the United States and having served in two Democratic administrations, as Bill said, Biden and Obama. I have had the opportunity in those roles to advance internet freedom in many multilateral, multi-stakeholder arenas, and I have generally been aligned with my government. I've also been an advocate in civil society and worked in academia and had the opportunity to engage the US government and many other governments, as well as the private sector, on all of the broad implications of digitization for democracy and human rights. Um, Generally speaking, I have been able to advance the same ideas and values in all of these roles. And I have seen a great deal of international cooperation on internet freedom and values-based internet governance. From my vantage point, the multi-stakeholder uh, internet governance community that has come together over the past 25 years has been relatively effective in grappling with conceptual changes, terminology shifts with respect to the internet, new and emerging technologies, but has done a relatively good job in advancing the core values. Um, I think it is useful also for context to recognize that until now, the US role in advancing global internet freedom over this period of time has essentially been a continuation of the role the US played in the world for the past 75 years. So I think to Ellie's point about, the history of nationalist isolationist tendencies in the US, I think post World War II, we have generally been, there's been bipartisan consensus, as Bill said, around the importance of US leadership in the world. And the US played such a central role in establishing that post World War II international order and has arguably been the global leader in the entire liberal democratic enterprise around the world. I think our American internet governance and internet freedom policy has flowed from that larger vision. And at least at a high level of generality and abstraction, there has been continuity across administrations on internet freedom, protecting the global open interoperable internet or the global open interoperable secure reliable internet, and supporting multi-stakeholder internet governance, and really in recognizing the importance of coalitions and values-based alliances as key vehicles for advancing US policy. So needless to say, never perfect in practice, or implementation, and we've definitely seen different phases and the shifts in thematic emphases over that 25-year period. But continuity of the core commitments, I would say, has been real. And here we are, less than 100 days into the current administration, and we have seen a dramatic reversal of that basic US stance and basic US values. Um, I think this administration is very intentionally signaling a shift from historical US commitments, from liberal democratic values, freedom generally, and the importance of alliances. And it seems to be retreating from the most basic concept of the need for international cooperation to protect the values-based world order that the US played such a role in creating. So it's still very early days, but I do feel like we're almost, it feels like a different country. And I think that is the goal of this administration. So uh, hard to calculate because it's early days, but I think this is going to affect many, many things for a long time. I'm sorry to give such a negative picture. I'll save little data points about my own experience and let you go on to somebody else, but I just wanted to share my general mood.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, Eileen. That was very, very useful starting point. We'll get more into the current state of play in a moment, but first we want to sort of like do a little taking stock of where we've been and how we got to where we are today. So, okay, great. Let's go then to David. David, your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And I want to thank you and Ellie for the opportunity to talk on today's panel and on this, what I think is an extraordinarily important and set of issues, and very timely, as Eileen pointed out, very, very timely. It's great to be on a panel with Jason and Eileen. It's a great honor to do that. So thank you very much. Let me step back for a moment and sort of run through a little bit of the history. And Bill, you touched on a lot of these things, but I think it's maybe useful because it seems to be part of the question about global cooperative involvement by the U.S. and by others is really about impact. What is it that's trying to be accomplished? And, perhaps showing my age, undoubtedly showing my age, I go back to the famous Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow back in Davos in 1996, in which his view at the time, which was not a crazy view, quite the opposite, it was actually, I think, quite a well-established view, was just, talking about the governments of the industrial world, as he called it. He said, we want to, leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. So the point there was, and President Clinton made a similar point when talking about the internet in China and so forth, saying, it's like trying to nail Jello to the wall. That is, the sense back then was that the internet was so fundamentally different that, in fact, it would elude government control in many respects, including the free flow of information and the like. That view of the late 90s, mid to late 90s, didn't last. And it didn't last because it turned out not to be realistic. It was not the way the internet operated. We ended up in the World Summit for the Information Society, which was in two phases, the UN WSIS, as we like to call it. And the first phase, was in Geneva in 2003. The US tried very hard to establish a global principle about what we might call internet freedom now. And not surprisingly, we ran into a lot of resistance. We were able to talk about the Declaration of Human Rights and use that and Article 19 as the basis for it. But in order to get that in, which was in paragraph 4 of the Geneva Declaration, we had to also put in paragraph 5, which basically was the other side of the Declaration of Human Rights, which reaffirms the role of governments in these areas. So we were pretty unsuccessful, I would say, in trying to advance that ball. And I would think it's probably worth remembering that WSIS itself was a watershed event in terms of the relationship between the international community and the internet. It was, I think, it's fair to say, originally sold to the international community, including to the United States, as being a discussion about how the internet could be used to further the human condition and how people can benefit from it. It, of course, quickly devolved, in my view, from that very lofty view to being a fight over ICANN and the role of the U.S. government with regard to the internet, something that we jealously protected and continued to protect across administrations. But then we got to the Tunis phase 2 of WSIS, the Tunis agenda. And there, I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in the sense that we did something which I thought was actually extraordinary, but probably turned out not to be very important. But at the time, I was very proud of it and very conscious of it. In paragraph 42, while everyone was focused, including us, on ICANN and the like, and fighting the U.S. hegemony in the area of the internet and the like, we were able to get in what I had tried to get in basically in the Geneva phase, which was paragraph 42, which was a reaffirmation of the global commitment to the freedom to seek, receive, impart, and use information, and the dissemination of knowledge. And unlike what we happened in Geneva, there was no second part to it. There was, other than a reference generally to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was no countervailing role of government associated with that from a national security. So in some respects, I think it's not unfair to say that might have been from an international perspective, where we had the global community recognize the importance of what we might call internet freedom in a fairly unfettered and unabridged fashion. As you mentioned, then in 2006, things started to change. And it was really driven by the success of China in the Great Firewall, and some of the actions that were being taken against some of the companies, including Yahoo at the time, who was very active in China. And so Secretary Rice put together what we called GIFT, which is the Global Internet Freedom Task Force, where we explicitly used the term internet freedom. And it was really a time when internet freedom became sort of a term of art that was used and advanced greatly. And that was used very aggressively for the remainder of the Bush administration. And then, as you pointed out, ratcheted up greatly, in my view, and appropriately, during the Obama administration by Secretary Clinton, who made this really a key part. And then that continued through, including, I would say, through the Biden administration and the strong support for internet freedom technologies and the like. But the point I think I'd like to sort of emphasize is, part of the reason I started with the Barrow quote, is the audience has changed over the time. It went from back in the 90s, where governments weren't supposed to be the audience at all because they weren't supposed to be involved, to a decade or so of the governments really, from a multilateral perspective, where the action was at the UN, at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, regional meetings and so forth. And now, in my sense, is that the world has continued to change. And that although there's a lot of activity in places like the UN, including a review of WSIS every 10 years and so forth, and a lot of discussion about that, and Bill, you touched base on some of that, that for a variety of reasons, that's not where the real action is. And by action, I really mean what impact it has on individual lives. And what we've seen now, and it's not abrupt, it's been changing for years, is that it is really, the focus has gone to individual governments. And those, every region, Europe is different than the United States in how they think about the free flow of information. China is different, Russia is different, Iran is different, the Middle East writ large is different, the Americas are different. And so the focus, it seems to me, has shifted over the past few years from multilateral statements of common views to now a focus on individual governments and what they are doing and what they are promoting or restricting. And so I think what I see happening going forward is that we are going to, as a practical matter, devolve, quite apart from who is in the White House. We're going to be refocusing, need to refocus more on what might be viewed as bilateral discussions of trying to convince governments one by one as to what the approach is, recognizing that the United States will probably always, as we have been, unique because of our First Amendment and First Amendment heritage, quite zealous on these issues, where domestically and therefore often internationally, but to be more bilateral and more specific in how we interact with others and try to convince them. And I think we will see what this administration does on these questions. As people have already pointed out, there's reorganization of the State Department. There's obviously refocusing being done. One can argue that it's more isolationist and so forth, but it's another way of also saying it's more focused in certain ways and less uh, dependent upon multilateral institutions and finding global common ground. I think that's where we have come. In some respects, it's not quite a full circle, but it's certainly a big shift from where we were in the 90s, in the 2000s up until fairly recently, and as we look ahead going forward. Thank you very much for that opportunity.
Great, David. That was very helpful. Okay, Jason P.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and thanks to you and Ellie and the team at Columbia for inviting me and putting this on. I've had the privilege to listen into some of your earlier webinars, and they've all been really informative. It's a really great audience, so very pleased to be here with you, and especially with David and Eileen, who are real kind of role models and pioneers in this space. So just to kind of give a little bit of my perspective, so I am at the moment the executive director of the Global Network Initiative, and I will be speaking here in a personal capacity. But G&I's story, as you situated it well, Bill, is part of this kind of historical narrative, and so I'll try and bring the perspective of kind of this multi-stakeholder coalition that I work with into the conversation. I think, I don't have a ton to add to the really great sort of historical framing that you started with and Eileen and David have built on. I guess I would just say, from my perspective as someone who sort of came into this world in the sort of 2010s when I joined the State Department, I initially was working on other issues, including sort of normative development around business and human rights and development of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. I then shifted. And that was the time that Eileen was the ambassador at the Human Rights Council, and when the first Internet Freedom Resolution was passed there, which was a big deal, building on Secretary Clinton's speech, which you referenced, Bill, which of course had built on the work of the previous Bush administration as well, and then setting up the Freedom Online Coalition. I joined right as the Snowden revelations were sort of shifting the narrative a bit, and had the privilege of trying to continue to defend the concept of internet freedom, in notwithstanding those revelations, which was of course challenging. But we managed to nevertheless continue, I think, to do important work to build on those concepts and build those sort of continuing diplomatic and multi-stakeholder networks in support of freedom online. I think I guess to me, I think of the development of the internet, there's obviously the kind of early R&D phases, before it became sort of more popular technology, and then the libertarian era, most associated with John Perry Barlow's declaration and kind of the early years of sort of grassroots, use and use cases, and then the kind of commercialization that began in the 90s. And kind of coincided with the multilateral phase that David described really well, as the UN, the ITU, and sort of other multilateral conversations were trying to sort of figure out, well, there does need to be some sort of international coordination here. How do we do that? Do we do that through our existing multilateral venues, or do we do that in some kind of different, unique way because this technology is special and different? And I think, again, thanks to the good work of David and others over time, we were able to kind of navigate that in a way that, did identify roles for relevant UN agencies, but also sort of recognize what was unique about the internet, and sort of accommodated a more open, more stakeholder-driven set of governance discussions and processes. I think a crucial inflection point, you can really either pinpoint it with Snowden or perhaps a few years later with Cambridge Analytica, but there was this sort of techlash that began in the 2010s and really led to a lot more assertions of domestic control, not just the sort of authoritarian model that China had been pioneering for years and was being picked up in other places like Iran and Russia, but also democratic rule of law abiding governments beginning to regulate much more aggressively, in particular around content on the internet. And so the Digital Services Act in Europe and online safety acts, first in the UK and then in several other countries, really marked an important, I think, pivot. And that, was something that didn't necessarily contradict the broader principles of internet freedom. And in some ways, I think the ultimate approach that the European Union took, which, to be candid, we were very involved with as the Global Network Initiative, of focusing more on the kind of processes, centering fundamental rights as the kind of baseline against which companies should assess their content moderation and should build their content moderation processes, and sort of due process that had to be applied consistently as they enforced those rules, was a good way to kind of acknowledge and address the fact that there were real harms that people were experiencing in the online world, but without imposing too much government control, and exposing the internet to the risks of kind of un, you know certainly approaches to content management that would be inconsistent with human rights principles. Um, that, of course, is now sort of brings us to kind of where we are today, and to some extent, the Trump administration's most articulated um, positions on what we might think of as internet freedom have been on the topic of what they refer to as censorship, and actually pointing to those very efforts in Europe, rather than the more authoritarian, more sort of less subtle efforts to control content that we've seen for many years in other parts of the world. And so that's a really interesting shift. I think, as Eileen pointed out, I think that's very significant. It's, of course, in line with broader tension, to use a diplomatic term, that we see between, or transatlantically at least. Um, it is interesting, I think, that the Trump administration has also been so consistently to date defensive of American internet corporate interests. So they have, not just pushed back against what they see as overregulation on the content side, but also it's notable that the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, sent a letter and made public a letter to the UK in response to a secret order that was leaked from the Home Office to Apple, to effectively disable encryption on cloud data. That was sort of a notable early sort of position that was articulated by the administration, more as a defense of US corporate interests, less as a principled defense of encryption as technology. Um, but that, to me, is sort of the through line that I see in at least the international posturing from the Trump administration, is, defending US corporate interests against regulation by other governments, especially democratic governments. And so I think that's going to create some real interesting tensions. US companies were already seen with quite a bit of suspicion and/or resentment overseas, and this will likely make some of those tensions more serious and harder for them to navigate. Um, Meanwhile, the administration has effectively reduced significantly. It has not completely eliminated its support for internet freedom in the kind of multilateral sense. Bill, you mentioned what you called the operational support, with the State Department, what we called programming. But there is a very significant amount of funding that Congress has authorized with the soft earmark every year since the early 2010s for internet freedom, which goes to both the development of anti-censorship tools, or censorship circumvention tools, as well as supporting digital rights organizations around the world, And many of those programs have been cut, not targeted for what they do, but just cut as a result of the broader reevaluation of foreign assistance that's been happening and dismantling of USAID. But that's had real material impacts on civil society around the world. I think to me, one of the things that I was most proud of in terms of the work that we did at the State Department when I was there was the sort of helping to incubate and sort of fertilize a global sort of movement of civil society digital rights organizations in different parts of the world who, some of which were media freedom or human rights organizations that, with support from the US and others, began to focus on digital issues and develop expertise and capacity to engage not just domestically, but regionally and even globally on those topics. Um, I always found that it was much more effective to have messages around the importance of free and open online spaces, free flow of information, pushing back against overbroad censorship coming from those types of organizations than from US government or US companies or even US civil society organizations. And I worry quite a bit. Many of these organizations are members of GNI now, so I know from talking to them that many of them have had to furlough staff, lay off staff, significantly reduce their activities. And I think that will not only impact their ability to push back against, overbroad government regulation in their domestic context, but potentially have significant knock-on effects regionally and globally. So it's had a real impact on kind of um, the the global majority component of this loose multi-stakeholder sort of coalition in support of internet freedom. So I think I just wanted to put my finger on that as well. I'll put in the chat a recent report that Tech Global Institute, which is one of our GNI members, recently put out on that, just trying to kind of document to the extent possible through surveys the impacts that those funding cuts have had so far. I think it's a bit oblique still because there's no sort of official reporting on which grants have been cut. And so I expect more of that story will become public over time. But anecdotally, it's having a really significant impact. And so I wanted to make sure that was kind of another point that we added into the conversation before we move on.
Thanks, Jason. That report is useful, and I indeed, as I just said in the chat, I think that the impact, it's so easy for people living in the U.S. to get to all debating. They're all focused on what are the budget cuts and which desks are eliminated and which programs. But we should be talking about how this impacts in the real world on the ground. And I think that that's a dimension that often gets lost. I do want to open it to the whole group for conversation in 10 minutes. But before I do, we've sort of blurred between past, present, and the kind of trajectory. But I'd like to hone in, if we can, just briefly, if people can, just a couple of minutes each, reply on this point, on the specific issue of like coalition building. I mean, you guys are all diplomats, so you know what was involved in bringing other parties on board, some of whom may have been reluctant, who had different domestic political considerations, legal traditions, whatever it may be, or geopolitical orientations vis-a-vis the US. So what does it take really to build coalitions around these issues? What are the challenges in doing that? And how, given what's happening now, does that change? I mean, that's a dimension I'd like to really just get on the table if we can before we open it up to the whole group. Eileen, could you maybe speak to that? I mean, you had to work with a lot of not just governments, but stakeholders around the world in trying to build support for this kind of agenda. So what's the lessons learned from that?
There are important lessons learned about how to build coalitions. I happen to be in a multilateral setting, and so the key insight was everything we did had to be cross-regional. We had to get partners from all over the world to make it work and to succeed. And that was always our modus operandi on every resolution. I want to, though, go back to a couple of points. David's point about the Trump administration is less focused on global coalition building and more focused nationally and internally. That is descriptively accurate. But I think it also has normative implications when you're thinking about the internet or internet freedom. And it brings me back to that first resolution on internet freedom was based on the concept of universal values, international human rights law. And that was relevant because of something Jason said, which was this recognition of the internet as a unique resource, a global resource that required thinking beyond national sovereign borders, back to the John Perry Barlow idea. And we needed a normative foundation for thinking about governance. And then that idea was brought into global multi-stakeholder internet governance, which is how we ended up with the multi-stakeholder idea of different coalitions coming together, different stakeholder groups. There, I'd also bring out the point, this was sort of the Vint Cerf writing about internet governance when you're talking about hardware, software protocols, the global open interoperability protocols that facilitate global connectivity. So sort of governance of the internet at the technical layers as distinct from or in connection to governance of what happens on the internet. And I think it has been somewhat easier to hold on to the global multi-stakeholder commitment when it comes to the technical layers, but there are challenges there as well, and less support for this global universal idea when it comes to content. And I'll just say, when you think about the point Jason just mentioned about the Trump administration, the number one thing that they've underscored so far is the concern about censorship in ways that ultimately undermine, arguably thinking about it and enacting policies in ways that actually undermine free expression, the core universal value that we started with. So we have a lot of challenges in terms of rebuilding coalitions, certainly with respect to what happens on the internet.
Yeah. Okay, David, your thoughts on coalitions and the diplomacy of it.
Sure, thank you. And I agree very much with what Eileen was just saying. The way I think about these things is I first ask myself the question, to what end? Why are we doing this? Why does it matter? And that was part of the reason why I went through sort of the history piece more, because I think in each of those times, the focus was correct. In the up until a couple of years ago, it was very reasonable to think that the best way to have impact on people's lives was through the multilateral process. I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the way it is going forward. You can ask the question, and I'm not suggesting necessarily the answer. If there is a UN resolution today on most of the types of things we're talking about, does it really have an impact on people's lives? It certainly has an impact on the perception of the countries supporting it or not, and where they're coming from. But what true impact does it have? And so that's why I always ask, to what end? And for my sense is that we see a world that has changed and moved in this area away from the importance of multilateral discussions, and they're not unimportant, but in terms of having an impact on people's lives, and much more towards, what is the position of governments bilaterally and for their own domestic audiences. The rise of sovereignty globally has been enormous over the past just couple of years. And we see this even within Europe, where, once you just had to talk to Brussels to some degree on these things, now you've got, divisions within Europe as to what the appropriate approach is. And of course, you have the UK having left the EU. So how you go about it depends a lot on what it is you're trying to accomplish. We used to spend a lot of time building coalitions, finding the least common denominator of language and so forth, because it was important to be able to speak collectively. The question I pose is, how important is it really to the world and individuals in our world for that to happen, as compared to speaking clearly and focus in a focused way that have impacts on individual governments and their people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dave. That's interesting. Well, I think certainly I would assume the dynamics of doing this are very different also within the industrialized world versus the more north-south kinds of things. And that presents interesting challenges too. But Jason, go ahead. Jason Pete.
Yeah, maybe just there, coalition building is important clearly in multilateral settings, and Eileen made good points about the importance of having to cut across regional groups, which at the UN are sort of the way everything is negotiated. Um, and I think, we very intentionally built the Freedom Online Coalition in a sense to provide scaffolding to these UN processes. So the idea was, let's find those countries that are willing to commit, at least, articulate a commitment to internet freedom principles, and then use the FOC to coordinate sort of around those multilateral processes, whether it was the Human Rights Council, the ITU, elsewhere. And I think there has been some positive impact of that sort of multilaterally focused coalition building. But I think there's another important element to coalition building that is a little bit harder to maybe measure, but just sort of anecdotally, I remember being in Tallinn for the 2014 Freedom Online Coalition meeting. And, this was, the kind of, as Estonia was kind of coming out as a leader um, on these topics before they had even yet, I think, fully integrated into the EU. I don't think they were on the euro yet. But their particular experience dealing with cyber threats from Russia really, I think, gave them some critical insights, and being able to put them sort of at the helm of this Freedom Online Coalition and give them the perch of kind of hosting, not quite heads of states, but secretaries of states and other important sort of diplomats and other stakeholders critically, I think was really valuable to them. A few years later, Mongolia chaired the Freedom Online Coalition. I think, Eileen, you were there, might have been there as well in a personal capacity at that point. I was there with the US government, and it was really poignant to be there, literally sandwiched between the two most authoritarian governments in the world, um, helping to support a government that was standing up and articulating a vision and supporting a kind of consensus around freedom that was very disfavored by those very powerful neighbors, right? So there are kind of experiences and opportunities like that, which, I think Moldova is another member of the Freedom Online Coalition. I remember, their government has sort of gone back and forth over time in terms of its pro and anti-Russian leanings, but at one point they had a government that was less pro-Russian, and we did some work to try and sort of support them through the Freedom Online Coalition with the Cyber Coordinator's Office run by Chris Painter at the time, the predecessor to the predecessor office to the um, Cyber and Digital Policy Office that Eileen then worked in under the Biden administration. So that kind of coalition building, a little bit more bilaterally and a little bit more kind of on the margins of multilateral engagements, I think is also important. And I think we're not going to see that from the Trump administration. I mean, everything is very clearly transactional now. And so multilaterally, the positions they've taken on the SDGs and the CSTD, it's clear that, as Henriette was pointing out in the chat, there's going to be some very different dynamics multilaterally. But I also think kind of bilaterally, there's just going to be less support for those countries that are trying to sort of hold on and kind of continue to push human rights more broadly and sort of internet freedom more specifically in their regions. So more pressure on Europe for sure to kind of step in and fill those gaps, whether it's capacity building, training, or just broader diplomatic support. more pressure on the multi-stakeholder community as well, to try and kind of hold the line. I would imagine both multilaterally and otherwise. So it's going to be tough, but I will say, this work, as this conversation has illustrated, didn't just start a few years ago. It's really got a pretty deep legacy, and there's kind of rich tradition and through lines and people, many of them on this call, who've been involved for so many years. And I think that gives me a bit of hope that, even though the US is a very powerful actor and its role is going to be fundamentally different, at least for the next few years, um, I think there is strength in networks like the Freedom Online Coalition. It's been interesting, where, as GNI is sort of part of this advisory network, the non-governmental advisory network, and just to see those governments are just continuing on, right? The U.S. has not been participating particularly actively, because I don't think the people who represent the U.S. government to the Freedom Online Coalition have gotten any instructions one way or another. So we'll see how that evolves. But the coalition is moving on. Estonia is chair again, stepping up and doing a great job. And so I think there's still room for good things to happen. We'll see what happens with WSIS later this year. I think that is going to be an important sort of opportunity to see where the rest of the world wants to go, if the US is going to sort of effectively remove itself from those negotiations. But I do still have some hope that not all of this great work that's been done over many years is going to be lost.
Great. All right, excellent. Thank you, you guys. So we've reached the top of the hour. I want to open it up to everybody who's joined us. There's a number of people who are here with us today who have a lot of interesting ideas and experience in this area. I'm looking at the chat, and I see a number of comments and questions from Henriette Esterhuizen in South Africa, Janis Karklins in Latvia, Alex Klimberg in Austria, on and on and on. So I hope some folks will want to raise their hand. Otherwise, if you don't, I can also read questions of Fiona here in DC. So Henriette, okay, great. So when you speak, could you please just introduce yourself so people know who you are? Okay, Henriette Esterhuizen.
Thanks, Bill. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good. I'm actually in a sort of remote area, so I'm not putting my camera on. Was for many years executive director of Association for Progressive Communications, a US-based international civil society organization working in this space. I've been involved in the IGF in many capacities, including I chaired the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group for a couple of years, some time ago. I mean, I was also at the CSTD last 2 weeks ago, as Bill mentioned. I think that we should also look at other scenarios. I think it's really interesting. I mean, the CSTD is obviously,
Sorry, the CSTD, you should say what it is, Henriette.
Commission on Science and Technology for Development, where, as Bill said in his intro, the 20-year World Summit on the Information Society Review was voted on, and where the US, I think for the first time in this internet governance space, made it clear that it's assuming a very different position. And I think that, there was this moment when the US made its stance clearly, where I think all the other, particularly the European governments and Canada, were holding their breath and thinking, what next? And the US played it very nicely. Actually, they also presented an alternative resolution. They supported the multi-stakeholder process. There was a moment when I think other governments actually considered going with the US, but they absolutely did not. And the reason they did not is because of what's happening in other spaces in terms of US relations with Europe. So I think, what's really interesting with this is that I think it is, there was a great sense of, I think among the Europeans in particular, a sense of loss and a sense of concern. But they got over it and they started negotiating with African governments on submitting text, something I have never seen at CSTD, and I've been going there since 2007. You saw some of the European governments who are not such big players in the space, Poland, for example, Austria, submitting text and getting away with it. There was a bit of looseness. It was maybe a lot of, not particularly relevant text. But the fact of the matter is that when the US exits from the room, it creates space for other players. And I think we're just beginning to see how that's going to play out. It could amount to nothing. There could be insufficient collaboration between G77 states or between pro-multi-stakeholder, pro-human rights states like South Africa and Brazil, in the space working more with Europe. There could be nothing, it could all fall apart. But I think it could also be quite interesting. And I think ultimately the loser here is going to be, in my view, maybe not at a national level, but in terms of influence in what ultimately is a global medium, which whether the multilateral system deals with it effectively or not, it's not going to let go of it. And with the US stepping back from being influential in that space, I don't know what would happen. I think it's quite interesting. I think the other thing that we see beginning to happen is more liability for US companies. I think it's beginning to happen a little bit. Someone mentioned content regulation earlier, and that's also going to shift, I think, how states elsewhere in the world collaborate in terms of trying to replicate what Europe has been doing with regulating US companies, which has been, which is also, it's evolving. And I think there are all kinds of challenges around that, including human rights challenges. But I think it's definitely a trend, which initially I think people in other parts of the world felt a little bit frustrated by it. But I think increasingly they see potential in collaborating with the European approach to regulating the space. So I think that's going to be interesting as well. And then David, Bill, I just had a question specifically for Eileen. I mean, another scenario that I think one can look at is what happens if there are new multinational binding treaties, such as the one on transnational corporations, for example, without the US. But even if the US is not a signatory to those treaties, US-based companies will have liabilities. I think that's a scenario that we should think about. And I wanted to ask Eileen specifically what she thinks about this endless negotiations on the transnational treaty on the human rights obligations of this treaty on human rights obligations of transnational corporations, whether she thinks there's anything to play with there.
Great, thank you. But Fiona, before I come to you, let me give people a chance to reply to this, because Andrea's put a lot of things on the table. And one point in particular, that this notion of other coalitions that may be formed, I think is important. I mean, you remember for years, people were saying, well, Europe is the new normative superpower. Europeans would say this to me all the time when I lived in Europe, that Europe is the new normative superpower. Will the Europeans or others be able to step into the void created by the US? What other kinds of coalitions might be created? These are, I think, pretty pressing questions. So, and there was a specific point to you, Eileen. So go ahead.
So I'll take the treaty point first. It raises a very controversial subject that many of us dealt with at the very end of the Biden administration on the cybercrime treaty, which is this was not a proud moment from my point of view. And one of the ideas was the United States is not going to join the treaty anyway, but other countries will, my concern, other countries will proceed. And you're right, US companies will need to comply. And so I think that was a bit of a blind spot in the US approach on that subject. And I think we're not winning that argument right now. I also want to go to the larger point you made that Bill just referenced about how, Andrea, you said, former allies in liberal democratic countries, Europe especially, are just plain angry about lots of subjects. And maybe they could have gone along with the US text, but they chose not to just because of that sentiment. And yes, it may create other spaces for different new coalitions and other players. I think the key question is whether those coalitions end up advancing what you said was a pro multi-stakeholder, pro human rights, universal values sentiments, or whether it really just empowers authoritarians and leads to a strengthening of China, Russia, and others. one last point, going back to David's key idea about, the impact of multilateral fora. I think well taken, and I think that idea that multilateral resolutions not clear exactly what the impact is in the real world and in the lives of people around the world. However, as Henriette noted in the chat, um, I will say over the last year, especially, even actually since the release of ChatGPT 2 years ago, there was an explosion of interest in multilateral fora on international AI governance. And the global majority, global South, very much yearning to be in that debate and part of the international governance conversation, as well as seeing it as the linchpin of their development and furtherance of the SDGs. And the China and the US were competing over who would get more support for their UN resolution on AI and the SDGs, AI and development. And it very much is a battle over gaining, having the optic with the global majority that one side or the other is more interested in your development and inclusion in AI governance and AI technology development. So, it's not a clear shift away from all multilateral fora. That subject, the UN is still, it's been very important up until very recently.
Thanks, Eileen. David?
I agree very much with what Eileen was just saying, and I think that illustrates very nicely. She did a great job of illustrating. It depends on what the it is that we're talking about, and what the impact is, and what the right forum is, because of the way in which either governments or other groups come to the discussion and what they find most useful. And I certainly hope Henrietta is right about the importance of the multilateral process in the global South, the developing world, because it makes me feel much better that all the time I spent in those negotiations really benefited people. I certainly hope that's the case, and it makes me feel better to know that others may feel the same way. And I'm really looking less about the past and more as we look ahead, and what is effective in that way. With regard to the comment about Europe having the regulatory lead, that's certainly been the case for the past couple of years. I think without doubt. But it'll be interesting to see if that is true going forward. When I was in Europe just a couple of weeks ago, much of the conversation I was hearing was of a shift within Europe about the regulatory nature, including about AI and a variety of other areas. It's the impact of the Draghi report, for example, and as a practical matter, as many of the European governments are finding that they need to spend a lot more money on defense than they have been in the past. They need to find the money somewheres, and although Brussels is allowing for some flexibility on deficits and so forth, nevertheless, they realize that they've got a new additional imperative to grow the economies. European economies have not been growing in the past few years. And as a result, there's a real review now going on, and there's going to be some announcements coming up about perhaps Europe being less regulatory in the way we think about it than has been in the past. And if that's the case, we may see some real sea change going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. And could people who are not speaking please mute? Okay, just Jason, and then we'll go to Fiona.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make the point that David already made, that
Okay.
I think Europe is reevaluating its approach to corporate regulation. Certainly, we see that. I mean, Henriette, I think you were asking specifically about the Business and Human Rights Treaty, which is not an internet-focused treaty, but will sort of create a permission structure for more effectively regulation and potentially liability over human rights impacts of companies, including for things that happen outside of their own jurisdiction. I think it is astute that you note that the U.S. retrenching broadly on the multilateral scene is more likely to ensure that that resolution moves, that process, which is pretty close to being finalized, as I understand it, will move forward pretty quickly. Europe is already engaged in the negotiation. Whether or not Europe will ratify that treaty, and sort of how quickly that gets to the minimum number of ratifications to go into effect is another question. But if I were a US company, or companies, multilateral company more generally, I'd be pretty concerned about sort of that kind of development and the broader kind of normative permission structure that it will create. And I think you can draw parallels to, as Eileen did, the Cybercrime Convention, which interestingly, I think we're more likely to see perhaps the Trump administration back away from, than the Biden administration wasn't willing to back away from, despite some good efforts, both internally and externally, to point out the challenges. So yeah, and then at the internet governance level as well, I think it'll be interesting to see to what extent companies see what happened at CSTD and decide that they need to be a bit more vocal in their engagements with the Trump administration about WSIS, and what they hope to get out of WSIS, or what they hope to not happen at WSIS.
Great. Thanks, Jason. All right. Well, Fiona, you have years of working in a decision-making role in U.S. government around these issues, so it'd be great to hear your views too. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, and hi to everyone. And I was just put in the chat a little bit and sort of responding to what I heard from my amazing former colleagues that all gave you great versions of what's been happening over the years. But my take on this is that I think the U.S. Has sort of stepped away from its leadership role, not in the last 3 months, but honestly in the last 8 or 9 years. And part of the challenge is that, at least from where I sit and my perspective, is that sort of the fundamental principles that guide US tech, internet, cyber, whatever you want to call it, policy are from 1998, and they've never been updated. And there's this reluctance and reticence to look at the issue as a big picture set for a variety of reasons. And until Washington decides what it wants in this space, it's hard to figure out how to lead in other venues, whether it's the UN or other international organizations and that kind of stuff. And, as David Gross mentioned, the First Amendment, is amazing, but I think it definitely challenges the ability of the US to lead. It's fine if you're trying to get to least common denominator and high level principles. And we spend a lot of time doing that. And that's really important to do. And I think the US has historically, until recently, been a big champion of that. The challenge is that when you go to the next order, which is how do you maintain your commitment to free expression and still solve the problems that people have? So I don't know if it was Eileen or Giannis talked about governance of or on the internet use issues. The US doesn't have a consistent policy or a consistent approach. And until it does, I don't think it can lead the solutions. And that's why you saw Brussels step in. And I think the Brussels approach is my observation, is overregulation and isn't particularly effective. So we'll see how that unfolds. But I think it's important to understand that part of the reason that the US is unable to lead is we don't know what we want, right? And that this particular Trump administration, I think that started several cycles back. So.
That's an interesting provocation, Fiona. I think before we go to the panel again, because we're going to run out of time, let me just try and see if there's any other people who'd like to take the floor and make an intervention, or I can read a couple of the points from the chat too and try to get them on the table. But if anybody'd like to raise their hand, please go ahead. David Allen, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. I'm ancient. I go back to WSIS, but enough of that. I'm struck how Eileen got us pointed at content instead of what goes on the bits and bytes. I think correctly. I'm particularly struck then how we find ourselves trying to sort out, as Jason led us to hear, there are harms that come from freedom of information. What I want to suggest is we will find a path forward when we can sort out the difference between what the totalitarian states would do in controlling what their citizens can and can't do, and Trump is trying to do, sadly, in this country as well. But I want to suggest when we can sort out the difference between those totalitarian maneuvers and what we as communities insist upon, even in this discussion, there are tacit rules that all of us know, things we cannot say, would not be permitted to say, would be run off if we did say. Uh, they're about the successful operation of community. Uh, if we can get our hands around a picture that describes how community operates well, we'll see those things that indeed are not allowed and are, despite our commitment to freedom, are not acceptable. When we can make that explicit, and we can contrast that with the way that totalitarians behave, and we might begin to see a path forward to what real freedom looks like with community constraint.
Thanks, David. That's a very interesting observation. Look, before we go to the panel, then we'll do one round and then we'll wrap up. Just to put a couple other points on the table for people. So Toshiya from Japan spoke about AI governance and suggested that there may be multiple kinds of regulations that will impact the industry and constrain private sector. And again, this goes to the point to how private sector players will be affected by these things, even if the U.S. is not really engaging in the discussion about what's to be done. Andre had multiple observations. I can't read through them, unfortunately, too many. And Alex Klimberg also raised this question about the distinctions between content and infrastructure and the roles of different kinds of norms pertaining to each. Giannis spoke to something similar. So I think this kind of distinction that, obviously we all recognize that the mechanisms of governance pertain to the infrastructure, raise a different set of questions from the ones having to do with content and what goes over the net. And that nexus obviously is much more difficult and much more difficult for democracies and illiberal countries to come together on a shared position on those latter kinds of issues. So, okay, so let's go back to the panel for a final round through all the different kinds of points that have been raised. Eileen, go ahead.
Okay, so I will take up Fiona's 2 points, and the second one joined by David. I think you are correct that the fact is the U.S., I think the U.S. has distinctively stepped back on our core values and commitment to universal values, international human rights, in the last 3 months. But the U.S. has stepped away from global leadership in international fora over the last 8 or 9 years. And you are correct that part of it is some of our ideas are very dated and we're stuck in policy articulation that stems from 1998 or whenever. I saw this firsthand very much in the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, where we were trying to respond to a clear signal from the international community. People want to talk about digital public infrastructure. And my entry to that subject was, let's develop universal safeguards that are baked into the technology design so that we are continuing to pull this thread of universal values regardless of the technology. There was so much resistance because the United States doesn't really have DPI. We don't have our own infrastructure that we can export externally on the in the full stack, so to speak. So it was just a lot of internal resistance to engaging in that, and yet the international community is absolutely there. And at UNGA last year, UNDP, OSET, the Office of Science and SET,
Emerging Technologies.
Amandeep, whatever his role is, the Secretary General, came together along with many other foundations, co-developed different players to launch this universal safeguards proposal. So that's fair. On the freedom of expression point that you hit, and several others. David, you hit this too. I also agree that until we settle our views about how do we address harms, and how that syncs with our approach to free expression, we are not going to be in a leadership position. And we are at risk of playing into the other alternative, which is the totalitarian alternative. Um, I will say Secretary Blinken tried hard. He used his speech at the Summit for Democracy on a whole new approach to strengthening information integrity as a proactive effort rather than a restraint on content, as like advancing the quality of content, and also the notion of building civic resilience to digital information manipulation. And we published a democratic roadmap for building civic resilience to this. The simple idea being that freedom of expression entails the freedom to seek, the freedom to receive, and the freedom to impart information, and also the ability to form opinion. And if everything in the information realm is just taken over by whatever you want to call it, disinformation, um, people's ability to form opinions is being impacted, and that goes to our commitment to protect free expression. So, we tried to develop a more nuanced position. We got support from the secretary. Was anchored in Article 19, but in ways that was consistent with the First Amendment, not antithetical, and trying to bridge that gap and emphasize the ability of the private sector to choose to protect free expression and exercising their own free expression with what they put out on platforms. But I agree, we've gone backwards. That is another area we've definitely gone backwards in.
Thanks, Eileen. Unfortunately, the clock is ticking away and we're going to run out of time. So if I could just ask the other two people to make quite concise in it, because we want to wrap in 4 minutes. So thank you, David.
Well, let me start by just thanking you for organizing. Obviously, the fact that we're bumped up against the deadline shows you how important and interesting this topic remains. And I thought today's comments were really terrific and appreciate the opportunity. I like to look ahead on these types of things. And I would recommend that one of the things that we're experiencing is a shift and a change from where we've been. One of the challenges I always had, especially when I was in government, is that my talking points change more slowly than the reality around me. And that's always a challenge. And so I would suggest that this is an opportunity for all the players, governments, civil society, others, to spend some time thinking about what the realities are today and going forward, and therefore what the vehicles to achieve the common goals that we all seek should be in the future. Preparing for the future by sort of clear-eyed views of where we are and where we should be going and how best to get there will serve us, I think, well going forward. Thanks again.
Thanks, David.
That's a great point, David. And I think just building on that, I would say, and to some of Henriette's comments as well, like, this is going to be a very disruptive moment. There's no doubt about that. But I think there is an opportunity for silver linings. I think, what we heard from Fiona resonates with me as well. That things haven't been great for a while, and so we're going to have to think creatively as a community, as sort of actors who have important perspectives and experience in this space about what the future we want to build looks like, not just how to put things back together the way they were. So that's the opportunity. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pain, a lot of challenge in the near term. I would recommend the book that Audrey Tang and Glenn Weil recently published, Plurality, which actually kind of does a good job, I think, telling the story of how what we're seeing as kind of mutually reinforcing forces between technology and democracy became untangled. And they're, I think, pretty interesting ideas about how to put it back together again. But again, in a new way, without kind of just reverting back to things, making things work the way they used to. So hopefully we together can navigate these choppy seas. I really appreciate Bill and Eli putting this together, and hope to continue to engage with all the folks here in this space and others going forward.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks everybody on the panel for great contributions. This was, I thought, a really interesting conversation, and very interested to get it from the perspective of people who've been involved in decision making as well. So, all right, I want to thank again everybody for joining us. I want to thank Jason Buckwhite, the executive director of CITI, for managing the meeting as always. We expect to reconvene in 4 weeks on May 21st, and so there will be an announcement for that. And again, anybody who wants to be on our mail list, please shoot a note to us and we'll get you on there. All right, I turn it back to Ellie for a closing thought.
Yeah, just for a second, we dealt with really very fundamental issues: liberty versus controls, national versus global, US approach versus European regulatory approach, internet in the past versus internet in the future, and I could go on. So I thought it was not a kind of what happened last week type discussion, but much more kind of deeper going into where's the internet, what are liberties on it, and where is it going? So thank you to Eileen, David, and Jason. Thank you also to our Jason Buckwhite, Executive Director. Thank you, Bill Drake, for organizing the session and the past ones and the future ones. And thank you, the audience, for your interest and engagement. And so I will say goodbye to you from New York. See you next month. Bye-bye.
Hey, ciao.